Today, we're tackling one of the biggest questions in history. Why did the West become rich? Now, the usual suspects get all the credit: coal, colonies, clever inventions. But what if the real story was different? What if the overlooked factor was extraordinary women making extraordinary choices about their lives? Welcome back to Breaking Math. I'm your host, Autumn Finef, and today we are tackling just that. To explore this, I'm joined by economist and author Dr. Victoria Bateman with her latest book, Economica. Together, we'll look at how women shaped prosperity, why economists ignored it, and what lessons we can draw from it today. Because remember, folks, history always repeats itself. Hi, Victoria. How are you doing today?
It's a pleasure to be with you. Even better for being with you, Autumn.
It's a pleasure having you on. So let's dive deep and start with the classic textbook story here. When people ask us why the West pulled ahead in the so called Great Divergence, they usually hear about energy, colonies, or institutions. Now, what's missing from that picture?
Women, and in particular, women's economic freedom.
So I will say, ironically, we're in a male dominated field, economics, mathematics, and two women
Absolutely.
on the podcast. So this is a rare occasion statistically. So, what if women's lives were actually the hidden difference? What exactly was going on in Europe that made this so unusual?
Yeah. So I think when you compare the West with what were the economic hotspots of the world for millennia, and we're talking about China, India, and the Middle East, I would say what most stands out isn't differences in terms of things like energy or colonies or institutions. It's actually differences in women's lives. And let me take that down to the most basic level. And that is, as a woman, your ability to go out into the world, to make your own money, and with that, to have the financial independence needed to take charge of the marriage decision. So to decide for yourself whether, when, and who to marry. And I think one of the things that is most astonishing about Europe in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution, so we're talking about the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, is actually that ordinary women at that time were not getting married until they were in their mid to late 20s. So 25 or 26 was a common age at which women would get married. And actually, not every woman was getting married. So a good 10% of women actually had the freedom to live an independent existence, for their whole lives. And that compares with those other parts of the world, China, India, the Middle East, where pretty much all women got married, and they got married young. So child marriage was extremely common, and women had very little control over who they married. So we're in a situation on that run up to the Industrial Revolution when the average woman in, let's say, Britain was going out into the world of work. She was working, say, as a dairymaid, or taking on an apprenticeship and working in a workshop or working in domestic service. She was earning her own money, she was saving, and then she was deciding for herself whether, when, and who to marry. And when she did marry, she was starting up her own independent household, compared with many other parts of the world where women were being married off at a young age by their fathers into an extended family where they would be under the watchful eye of their parents-in-law, where they would be, because they're married young, they're, as a result, childbearing from a young age. And so women end up in a situation where they have very little control over their lives, where they are committed to a life of childbearing with no control over how many children they have, no control or very limited control over household expenditure. And what we're talking about here, remember, when we're talking about women, we're talking about half of the population. And it is this really extreme difference in the lives of ordinary women that I think is key to understanding why it was that Europe was not only able to catch up with parts of the world that had been ahead for millennium, but overtake. How the West managed to make it to the top of the global league tables, economically speaking.
So essentially, in other parts of the world, they ignored women.
So women were sidelined. Women were treated as second-class citizens, as pawns, with very little control over their lives. And I think, I think that in some ways, I would say actually that in whatever society you look, in whatever period of time, women have been valued, whether that is reproductively, because of what we can do with our wombs, or because of what we can do with our hands, like the cloth that we can make that has formed the currency of global trade for centuries. We are a valuable resource, women, and we always have been. And societies kind of know that. But precisely because we're valuable, people want to capture and control us, in a historical context.
Yes.
And societies have come up with, 101 different ways of capturing and controlling women. So whether that is at the level of states, for example, having legal guardianship systems through the legal system that place women under the control of men, or whether it is at the level of families. So, for example, in China, the practice of foot binding, breaking the feet of your daughters to render them immobile, such that they have limited ability to go out into the world and make their own choices, make their own decisions, so that you as a family can then, for example, chain them to the spinning wheel in the home and have them producing the cloth that you then as the family can extract the value from. So I think, there is this irony that this mistreatment of women isn't necessarily because we're considered worthless. In many ways, it's because we are valuable. You don't want to capture and control things that are worthless. You want to capture and control things that have value. But what I argue in Economica, what happens when you try and capture and control that thing of value is that, in a sense, it turns to dust. You kill off the golden goose because,
And
as
it creates ripple effects throughout
it does,
society,
it
right?
does.
So whether you're looking at teenage wage work outside of the home
Yeah.
and the ability to keep wages,
Yes.
let's dive
Yeah.
into some
Yeah.
of these ripple
Ripple
effects
effects. Yes.
throughout history. What happens with later marriages
Yeah.
in this case?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are 4 or 5 positive effects, I would say, on Western Europe as a result of women having this ability to take charge of the marriage decision and with it getting married later in life rather than being married off as girls. And the first one is because as a result of that, women marry later and then with it families are smaller because women are, historically you had children only within marriage, and so your childbearing starts once you're married. So if you're not married until 26, you're not starting, your family until you're 26. Compared with starting a family at 13 or 14, you're going to end up with fewer children in your household. And this means that your economy is subjected to less population pressure. Now, your population will have the ability to expand and contract with the economy. So population can move in sync because what happens at the individual level is if as a woman, when you get married, you start your own household, you have to be financially independent to do that. You're not being absorbed into a more traditional extended family household where you're living with your parents-in-law. They're therefore providing you with food and shelter. In Western Europe, where you start your own household upon marriage, you have to think about financially supporting yourselves. And that means that your ability to get married and start a family depends on the economy around you. So if times are good, you can get married a year. You can say to the person you're engaged to, let's take the plunge. We can do it now. And that means if times are good, People get married a little bit younger, they have more children, that's providing, the extra manpower perhaps that the economy needs. Whereas if times are bad, you say to your partner, okay, well, let's hold on. Let's reassess in a year from now. And then if times are still bad, you might reassess in another year from then. That process of that ability to postpone the marriage means that you are lessening population pressure within your economy. So what happens is that in Western Europe, you avoid excessive population pressure, and the population growth that you do have is able to keep in sync with the ability of the economy to support it. If times are good, it will naturally expand. If times are bad, fewer marriages happen, fewer babies are born, and so you don't have population running away with resources. And I think that was extremely important, because what that meant is by avoiding population pressure, not only are you avoiding some of the resource crises that happen, say, in China, in pre-industrial China, where you have some really pretty horrendous natural resource crises, population getting out of control, running out of land. And with that, deforestation then silts up rivers, for example, because with fewer trees, there's nothing to hold the soil together. Soil leaks into the waterways. As the waterways silt up, that hurts trade. So natural resource crises that are bad for the economy, you don't have the same extremities happening in Western Europe, but also because there's less population pressure, you can support a higher wage economy. So the equilibrium in terms of labour demand and labour supply is such that you have a higher wage economy. And that is extremely important, because if workers are that little bit more expensive, then companies, businesses are better incentivized to mechanize. So if you have lots and lots of cheap labour around you, then there's less incentive to mechanize the production process, to develop and to adopt new technologies, because you can just use a cheap labor process of production. Get people to do repetitive tasks, with their own two hands. Whereas if wages are more expensive, then you want to develop machines such that you can economize on your use of workers. And when we think about what is the Industrial Revolution ultimately, this big deal in economic history, the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century, that really crystallizes the West's dominance of the global economy. What was the Industrial Revolution? It was ultimately about technology. It was about mechanization. It was about engineers and inventors and innovators. And why did that happen? It happened in part because you're a high-wage economy. And where did the high-wage economy come from? It came from the fact that everyday women had the ability to take charge of their lives, and as a result, families were smaller. The other thing it does is, because families are smaller, they can better afford to educate the children that they do have. So if you've got 10 children, trying to afford to apprentice each of those children, to educate each of those children, it's too expensive. If you've got 4 or 5 children, you're better able to afford to educate at least some of your children. And so you have, a higher skill base. And then in terms of institutions, so in terms of democracy, there's a sense in which political institutions at the level of the economy as a whole mirror what's going on within the home. So if you are brought up within a patriarchal traditional family, where you're told from a young age to do as you're told, where you're told to shut up rather than speak up, to always go along with whatever the patriarch wants, the father or the grandfather. And of course, this applies to young men as well as to young women. Patriarchy.
Quite naturally, yes.
Absolutely. None of us get a say. Then in that type of family situation, you're not socialized to ask questions, to hold people to account, to disagree, to debate. And yet that is what we need for democracy. Not only for democracy to get established, but for democracy to be sustained. Because in a sense, the more difficult thing isn't just establishing democracy, it's sustaining it. And democracies only sustain themselves if we as people hold our politicians to account, debate with one another, no matter how fearsome that can be, ask questions rather than doing as we're told, and rather than shutting up when instead we need to speak up. And, ultimately that, what we need, the way we need to behave as citizens, if democracy is to be secure and to be sustained, that is rooted in what's happening within the home. And so in Western Europe, where women are going out into the world, taking charge of the marriage decisions, they're able to avoid child marriage. They're able to avoid being brought into the home of their parents-in-law where they're being told what to do. They're setting up their own independent household. Then that is acting as a model for political institutions more generally. And we see that in Britain, for example, in the 17th century, British people demanding of democracy, tired of kings and queens bossing them around and telling them what to do, wanting to hold them to account, wanting to have their voices heard.
So the power dynamics in this essentially wants to quiet women or quiet the newer generations.
Yes, that is right. That is right. It's about traditional elites, whether that is, landed aristocracy or whether it is the patriarch within his own family. It is about them having a voice, them being able to control the people within their domain versus us all as individuals being free to take charge of our individual lives.
So in this case, when you're saying fewer children, higher wages, more apprenticeships, and even with the rise of democracy, all trace back to women's independence. Now, it's bold, but
Bold.
as we're looking at this, evidence shows that it's the trend. So how did those choices actually fuel things like technological change and capitalism? But let me add to that.
Yeah.
But if women were so central in these decisions, why didn't the economists put them in the story from the start?
Yes, such a great question. Certainly when we think about economic history, we think about the lives of men. We think about from Genghis Khan and Hernan Cortes to Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan, the men who've become household names. And I think to a large extent, we assume that men were the people bringing home the bacon, that men were sustaining their wives and children on the incomes earned in farms and factories or by working as butchers, bakers and candlestick makers. That, in other words, men were the people who dealt in money, the economy was just for men, and that women were the people dealing in that altogether different currency, the love that makes the world go round. So, in other words, we have this vision of economic history in which women have spent most of history as housewives. And it is with that idea, that impression of history, one that I think is so common in popular culture. We think about TV series and films, whether it's Mad Men, or whether it's period dramas. We're fed this impression that women were housewives. But also in economic textbooks, you open the average economic textbook and you will find a whole section on how women entered the workforce in the 20th century. How, for example, the world wars encouraged women to do men's work. Whilst men were off fighting at the front, we have Rosie the Riveter, in the factory doing what was previously a man's job. And again, this helps to create this impression that before the 20th century, women weren't in the economy, that they were housewives. So if you assume that women have spent most of history as housewives, then naturally when you're thinking about the economy, you think about men. Now that vision of the past is one that I attempt to shatter in the process of Economica, to show, no, women haven't spent most of history as housewives. They have been doing all kinds of things in the economy, from helping build pyramids in ancient Egypt and plumbing the ancient city of Rome to not just making cloth, but mining silver and mining coal. And actually it was women's financial independence that they got through their work that, as we've discussed, I argue that was actually key to sowing the seeds of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the Western world.
So, thinking about this a lot more, every city has statues of male inventors and industrialists, but not women? Or as much. I've
Not
seen a
as much.
couple here and there, but
Yeah,
not that many.
that's
So,
right.
why has economics been so blind to these contributions?
So is it in part that economics has long been a male-dominated subject, and economic history too? There are far more men doing economics and economic history than there are women. And of course, this creates, to an extent, a vicious circle. Because if the people doing it are ignoring what's happened to the lives of women, then perhaps women are not so attracted to economics and economic history. They feel perhaps it doesn't speak to them. And so they go off and they do perhaps social history instead, or sociology instead, because economics and economic history sadly just don't speak to them. So I think the only way we're then going to break out of that, vicious circle is to really confront ourselves and as academics and say to ourselves, look, is this impression of the past that we're creating, is it a truly representative, is it a truly accurate one?
And I think that also looks at gender gap in economics degrees and even professors.
Yeah.
It parallels a lot in the universities, and just seeing how the gender gap plays an effect even in, I'll add engineering and mathematics. My big question is, why are we still seeing this?
Yeah. Yes. Well, we're back to this vicious circle because sadly, certainly in terms of economics, it's not really getting that much better. When you look at the number of young women that were studying economics back, 10, 20 years ago versus today, it's really not getting that much better. And there have been initiatives, to try and improve it. And I'm sure those are having an effect in the places where those initiatives are being welcomed and being invested in. But if we are going out into the world and creating this impression that what makes, countries rich has nothing to do with women's lives, then why, as a woman, would you want to study economics? In fact, it might perhaps turn you against markets and trade and business, and perhaps push you in a very different direction. So, and, it's so important because, as an economist, what you're ultimately looking at are the big questions. Why are some countries rich and others poor? You have the lives of people potentially in your hands. If you get your policies right versus if you get your economic policies wrong, we are talking about affecting the lives of millions of people. And if you affect people's lives for the worst, then the knock-on effects in terms of, the poverty that people are exposed to within the family as children, and then how that goes on to affect them in later lives. As economists, we're not just paper pushers. What we have to say and what policies we recommend really matter. And so, why wouldn't women be interested in that? Surely we're
Yes.
all, and women are interested in that. It's just the stories that we tell that turn people off. And that's what needs to change.
Now, let's take a little bit of a pivot here. And you talk about household dynamics quite a bit in the book. And as we all know, households are not frictionless.
No.
Whether we imagine households as neat optimization machines and maximizing happiness, but the reality that we're looking at, as you portray, is that it deals a lot with exploitation, unequal power, unpaid labor, and that looks very different. So, what do economists miss when they've modeled the family this way?
Yeah, yeah. Do you know? So here's the irony. Economists are often criticized by non-economists for the assumptions that they make. And those assumptions include for the fact that the fact, I shouldn't say fact, the assumption that we're, self-interested, maximizing, optimizing, rational agents. These are the assumptions that make mathematical modeling easier. We can, assume people maximize profits or maximize utility, and then we can do some kind of differentiation and work out, the optimal outcomes and so on. So there's this kind of standard set of assumptions that we make as economists. And it's been quite trendy in the past couple of decades to critique economics, to criticize those assumptions. So to try and suggest, actually, no, we're all a bit nicer in the real world, and we can we're all these kind of selfish people. And that
Right.
actually, by assuming we're selfish, it somehow makes people selfish. I mean, I actually think the counterpoint to that is that, if you were to instead assume a world in which everyone was altruistic and we were all nice to each other, then how do you understand the mistreatment and exploitation that happens to women within their own home? And the reality is that, there's a lot of unpaid work that women are doing within the home. And actually, if you add up the value of that unpaid labor, and there have been various calculations, but based on the calculations that have been done, we're talking about between 20 to 60% of GDP. So the amount of unpaid work that women are doing in the world is the equivalent to an extra 20 to 60% of GDP. So that's, the cooking, the cleaning, the caring for children, the caring for elderly relatives, and so on. If you take the upper end of that estimate, that's 60% of GDP. Leaving that out of our GDP calculations would be the equivalent to leaving the US, China, the EU out of global GDP calculations. I mean, there's a lot of work that women are doing within the home that is unpaid. But whilst they're doing this work, it doesn't guarantee fair treatment within the home. And we see that in the world all around us. And we see that, for example, in India, the fact that women who are expected to take on the life of a housewife, where they will be committed to a lifetime of unpaid labor within the home, creating real value for their families, birthing children, looking after parents-in-law, feeding their husbands, that despite that fact, they're expected to bring a dowry into marriage. They're expected to bring financial resources into marriage to compensate for the fact that they are not earning their own money. And moreover, women who bring more financial resources into marriage, more of a dowry, are treated better. So ultimately, money talks. Without your own money, you are liable to mistreatment and exploitation. And that's because you are rendered dependent on others. And unless you have outside options, unless you have an ability to escape that situation, then people will take advantage of you. So, no matter how much value you are creating for your family, unless you yourself have that value in your pocket, you are prone to exploitation. So, so in some ways, back to the old-fashioned economic assumptions of people being self-interested. If your partner is self-interested, if your parents-in-law are self-interested, then actually with those kinds of assumptions, we can better understand perhaps the exploitation that happens within the home. Whereas if we assume that as households, people act as one and behave altruistically, then we assume away the problems that go on in the lives of so many women across the world. And so this is why, ultimately I believe that as a woman, you have to be able to build your own independent financial existence in life. You cannot be dependent on men. And no matter, sometimes as a society, we're promised that, let men be the breadwinners. Sometimes, throughout history, we've been told that being in the workplace, it's hard. You're open to exploitation. Instead, stay in the home where you can be protected, where you can do a much more important job of having children and looking after your parents-in-laws and so on. Trust in the male breadwinners to look after you. The male breadwinners will provide. And sadly, it so often doesn't work out well for women that way.
That
The
includes
chivalry.
today as well.
It does include the whole trad wife movement, sadly. The reality of the world is that, everyone is a mix of self-interest and the opposite. And because of that, as women, we need to be able to have our own independent financial existence. And that, as I argue in the book, that was actually what was key to the rise of the Western world. That was what was key to, through those ripple effects. It's not just good for women to be financially independent. It's good for the economy as a whole. And that means ultimately, it's also good for men.
Some listeners might be surprised to hear that under Islamic law centuries ago, daughters could inherit half a son's share.
Yes.
So sometimes giving them more rights than
Yeah.
women in Britain and in
Yeah.
Europe as a whole. How did property and inheritance shape women's roles in economies? What does the wealth gap look like? And I'll add one more thing to this. This brings a larger picture, right? It's how do women's freedoms actually shape not just families, but the way that markets and states function?
Yeah, great. Okay, so the Middle East. So here's the
Yes.
fascinating thing. Whilst in Europe, women were free to leave the home as teenagers, go out and take a job on a farm or in a factory or in a workshop and build their own independent financial existence through that means. They, for a long time, didn't have full control over property once they were married. And of course, that made doubly important marrying the right person because you need to marry someone you trust. So essentially, once you got married, for wealth and resources combined into one single pot. And this was the system of coverture. So in a sense, you were covered by your husband. So your husband was the person then responsible for looking after that combined pot of wealth and resources. So until that point, when you were a single woman, you had your own independent financial existence. Once you were married, if you did decide to get married, then your husband had this control over the combined marriage pot. Now compare that with the Middle East at the time. So in the Middle East, it was less common for unmarried women to go out into the labour market beyond their own home to work and earn their own financial existence in that way. So in terms of labour markets, women were more limited. But in terms of capital markets, so if you're thinking about wealth and property and capital, in terms of capital markets, things were actually in many ways easier for women in the Middle East. So in the Middle East, women, as you said, had rights to an inheritance. They also had dowries and they had control according to Islamic law, they had control over those dowries and those inheritances. Now, that was great if you were a woman from a wealthy family. So this is the thing. For ordinary women who don't really benefit, whether you're a boy or a girl, if you're not in a particularly wealthy family, and inheritance doesn't matter all that much anyway. So this, in the Middle East, this was particularly beneficial for women within wealthier families. But what it did mean was that for women in wealthier families, you were expected to take an active role when it came to how your money was invested. And so whilst women, for example, were not there working in workshops and working in shops, behind shop counters, they invested in property, in commercial property. They invested in the licenses that craftsmen needed to, the equivalent of licenses that taxi drivers might need today. They invested
Sure.
in buying and selling those licenses. So women were really quite active as investors, whereas in the West, it took it was the first big fight of feminism actually in the 19th century. It wasn't the vote. Before the fight to get the vote was the fight for married women to have control over their own property. And that was a fight in the late 19th century. And that was a fight that was won by the 1880s. And actually, from that point on, When you look at the railways, the railroads, for example, in the latter part of the 19th century, 1 in 3 investors in the railroads, in the railways, were women. So, women had this great appetite for investing, but men were very much in charge of the capital for a long time. So in the West, women kind of more active when it came to labor markets. In the Middle East, wealthier women more active when it came to capital markets. But if we're talking about the majority of the population rather than just the wealthy elite, then actually you'd have rather been a woman in Britain, I would say, than one at the time in Saudi Arabia.
So today we even look at our current
Mhm.
wealth for women in general.
Yeah,
Women earn only about 57% of men's total income.
that's right. That's right.
And
And that's
there's,
And that's bigger than the gender pay gap. So often when we think about the gender pay gap, there's this kind of 20% figure quoted. But that's because you're just comparing women in work with men in work. So if you were to also factor in the women that are not earning, so you've got those that are, so you've got about a half of women across the world of working age are in jobs, and they're on average earning 20% less than men. But then you've got the other women that are not earning anything. So if we combine all those women together, then overall, women as a whole are taking home only 57% of what men are taking home in terms of their income. But what's even more frightening is then the gaps in wealth, because the gaps in
yes,
wealth are even bigger.
it's only about 20% of women are landowners.
So that's right, no more. And do you know, the even more frightening thing is the data is so dodgy on this, because actually, whilst we have a lot of data, a lot of statistical agencies have been able to collect data that allows us to look at, what women are earning, income of men versus women. When it comes to wealth, where, in terms of what people, what wealth people own, it's not the data in terms of whether it's a man or a woman that owns a particular property or a particular patch of land or stocks and shares. The gender of the person that owns that isn't always known, and the data on that isn't always collected. So really, this is just best guesses that we have from international economic organizations, that based on the data that we do have, that women own no more than 20% of land across the world today. Now, let's compare this with ancient Egypt.
Sure.
Ancient Egypt, it was something like 12 to 15% of landowners were women. So we're not much better than ancient Egypt. And actually, in North Africa and the Middle East today, less than 5% of landowners are women. So things have gone backwards rather than forwards in the Middle East and North Africa compared with where we were in ancient times. So the wealth gaps are much bigger than the pay gaps. And I mean, if we look at the very top, if we look at global billionaires, if there were the same number of female global billionaires as there were male ones, we'd have 7 times as many Oprah Winfreys and Taylor Swifts and Sheryl
Yes.
Sandbergs. 7 times. Wouldn't that be a wonderful world to live in?
It
7
would be
times as
so
many
much
Taylor
nicer.
Swifts. Yeah, it would.
I mean, just thinking about Taylor Swift and her Eras tour, she paid, I don't know, just exorbitant amount of
Yeah.
money to everybody on her team for bonuses, for just hauling the gear, equipment, taking care of anybody who was even.
She's a remarkable woman, isn't she? A real role model in terms of, if you're going to be a global billionaire, then do it the way that Taylor Swift does it.
Yes. And it's essentially the give back to the communities that
Yeah.
support you model.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And as women, we put so much emotional labor into that already.
Hmm.
We need to be fairly compensated to be able to financially do that as well.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So, if we're looking at this beyond just markets versus states, right? The 20th century politics framed it as a markets versus states, sort of capitalism
Yeah.
versus communism. But I noticed in your book, you argue that some of the most successful societies actually blended both. Now, women's freedom was the key, but can you elaborate on that a bit for us here?
Yeah. So I think women's economic freedom gives us both better markets and better states. So we can have the best of both worlds. So in terms of markets, and again, I want you to compare those, those historic differences in the way families functioned in, say, China, India, and the Middle East compared with Western Europe. So, where you have these extended traditional family structures, within that large extended family, you can do a lot for yourselves. You can have your own mini welfare state, for example. The richer members of the family can subsidize the poorer members of the family. Also, you can have your own military system, your own mini military system. So the young, muscular members of the family can provide the muscle power and the defense needs of your family as a whole. Think almost mafia style,
Yes.
big extended mafia style families. One of you could be, look after the legal needs of the family. One of you could specialize in being the builder, the plumber. So there's so much that you can do within your own family. You don't, okay, you might deal with people beyond your own family, but you have less need to do that within that traditional extended family system. Compare that with what happened in Western Europe, where you have, young women going out into the world, taking charge of their lives, earning money, and setting up their own independent household. So this is where nuclear families come from, setting up your own little nuclear family. With your own little nuclear family, you can't do everything for yourself.
Right.
You have to engage with, trade with other people out there. If your roof needs fixing, you might need to, go down the street and say, hey, can you fix the roof for me? And in return, I will, perhaps look after the food for your next family party or, something like
Yes.
that. So you have to trade with other people. And with that, you develop the type of underlying trust and social capital that goes beyond those tight family networks, that generalized trust and that social capital that is so important for making sure that markets can function and markets can become deep. That if there's something that we need in life, we can go into the marketplace and we can engage with people and find someone we trust in order to get what we need. And that in turn allows us to specialize in what we're best at doing at individuals, and so helps the economy to prosper. So markets are able to develop to a more sophisticated level and to become deeper in that, where you have a society of that kind. And then in terms of the state, and this takes us back to what we were discussing earlier, that, do you want a state that is responsive to the needs of the general population, a democratic state that listens to the needs of the general population, that therefore is held to account if it is not offering economic policies that will deliver, that will grow the economic pie, that will make us, in the long term, richer, that will mean that our children and our grandchildren can live a better life than our own. So investing in infrastructure, for example, investing in, health and education and so on. And where does that type of democratic and responsive state come from? It comes from the fact that within the family from a young age, we are encouraged to hold people to account, to ask questions. And that only happens within the type of family system that is a more gender equal family system. It doesn't happen within a more traditional family system where you have a more patriarchal structure, where young people are not allowed to speak up, where they're not allowed to ask questions, where they're not allowed to hold people to account. So I do think that societies where women are freer, can go out into the world, can build their own independent financial existence, can take charge of the marriage decision, can set up their own family household, that makes for both better markets and better states. And that is the secret recipe in terms of getting the best of both worlds.
Now, getting the best of both worlds. You often talk about times where societies pull women back
Mm, mm.
just as they're most needed, especially throughout history. Now, you also mentioned this in a prior book that you wrote, Naked Feminism, and you call this the cult of female modesty. So, do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah.
And how even backlashes happen in women's freedom, which clearly fuels prosperity.
So one of the big themes of Economica is really the story of the rise and decline of civilizations throughout history. I mean, in a long-term perspective, that is what economic history is all about. It is about one civilization after another acquiring great wealth, doing great things before it ends up in a ditch, ready to be found by some unsuspecting archaeologist. And what I say in Economica is that you cannot understand that story of rise and decline without including women, because every successful civilization of its day, whether that was the Romans, whether that was the Islamic Middle East, in the medieval period, whether that was Imperial China in the Song dynasty. So we're
Yes.
talking about the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. You know, every successful civilization of its day has been one where women were there at the heart of the economy. And similarly, every subsequent civilizational decline has involved a process of marginalizing women, limiting their options, limiting their choices. And so this happened in the Roman economy, and I argue that this is the missing piece when it comes to explaining the decline of the Roman Empire, when Emperor Augustus started to worry about falling fertility rates. He started to worry that women were not so keen on marriage, that young women were not enough of them were getting married. He also, Emperor Augustus, worried about immigration. He worried that the Roman culture was being eroded by immigrants, by foreigners. And actually, Augustus worried in particular about what he called the Greeks and the barbarians. And, his response to that was to say that women needed to spend more time, Roman women, pure Roman women needed to spend more time breeding for the good of Rome, to spend more time in the home. And he manipulated all kinds of laws to try to encourage women to do that. And, it's never as obvious as we're going to make a ruling that women can't work. Instead, it is more subtle things like, for example, making men's promotion prospects within the administrative structure of the Roman Empire dependent on how many children their wives have. And that, of course, then means that wives are put under more pressure to have more children.
You trace that there's three key triggers for rollbacks, whether in the cult of female modesty. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah. So, and even today, I think when we look across the world, when we look at so many of the problems that women across the world face, whether it is child marriage, whether it is in Afghanistan, women being pushed out of the workplace and even pushed out of universities and schools, whether it is forced veiling, whether it is denial of access to medical technology, certain medical technologies, whether it is not being able to join certain parts of the economy, take certain jobs. So many of those problems that women face across the world today are rooted in what I call the cult of female modesty. And this is the idea that a woman's worth depends on whether her body has been seen or touched. So this results in all kinds of social practices and economic policies. So, for example, if you believe that your daughter is going to be rendered worthless if she is seen or touched, then of course you want to veil her. You also might not want her to go to university because the risk is she meets boys and might develop a relationship with a boy. You might, for example, want to marry your daughter young to someone of your own choosing so that she doesn't get a bad reputation, as a teenager, that could then jeopardize her chances when it comes to marriage in her 20s. So child marriage also is a response to the idea, or a response to the concern that your daughter will be rendered worthless if she is seen or touched by her male peers. So this cult of female modesty that sees a woman's worth, respect, and value based on her bodily modesty is something that sadly has been recurrent in societies throughout history. And, in many ways, I would say it is rooted in some respects, to biology, to paternity uncertainty. And the thing is that whilst you can always know who is the mother of a child, it's very difficult to know for sure who the father is, particularly before modern day paternity testing. And so I think this is underlying it why so many societies want to try and control women's bodies, because they are worried about men impregnating women, that they don't want to be impregnating women. So it might be that you're a husband and you're worried about your wife mixing with men in the workplace. It might be that you're a father worried about your daughter mixing with boys at school or at university. So the fact that women can become pregnant and that who the father is so open to question, I think drives so much desire to control women's bodies and to so easily write them off based on who has seen, touched, had access to those bodies. And I would say that, there in some societies have gone easier on women than others. So, not all societies force women to veil. Not all societies force their daughters to marry as soon as they reach puberty. Not all societies deny women access to doctors because, having a medical examination requires a doctor to touch you, or to take your pulse or whatever. Not all societies do that. So why is it that some societies place more worth on a woman's body modesty than others, and so want to take these measures that really act to constrain women's lives, and so with it constrain them economically, constrain their access to education, their access to work? I say that there are three things in particular that tend to push societies in this negative direction: inequality, warfare, and population growth. So first of all, if you have rising and really quite significant inequality, then what happens is that inheritance becomes a bigger deal. So who is going to inherit your money becomes a bigger deal. Now, because of paternity uncertainty, you want to make sure that your offspring really are your own offspring. So if you're a wealthy man and you want to pass your money onto your children, you want to make sure that those children that your wife is giving birth to really are your children and not someone else's. So you tend to find in societies where you get escalating inequality and high levels of inequality that there is more of a demand for pure wives, for wives that are kept away from other men and that are from a young age therefore brought up in a way that they're concealed from other men, forced to veil, that they're not allowed to go out to school, to go out into the workplace, to mix with men, such that then when they're married, that they can continue those practices. So there's no chance of them being impregnated by someone else and your wealth then ending up in the wrong hands. So inequality tends to push societies in this rather negative direction, this direction of controlling women and particularly their bodies. Also warfare. So in periods where you've had more intense warfare, then women who are out there mixing in society, mixing with men, are seen as potentially fraternizing with the enemy and potentially then in turn giving birth to the offspring of the enemy. They are also women in that situation, perhaps in situations of warfare, sadly more prone to being used as a weapon of war by the other side. So in situations where societies exhibit clear signs of warfare and continued warring tendencies, then again women tend to be pushed to veil more, to be kept out of the public sphere, to be kept within the home, whether for their own safety or because fathers and patriarchs worry that they'll be fraternizing with the enemy. And then the third thing is population growth. So in situations of where population growth is perhaps seen as getting out of control, then because women are the people that give birth, then women start to be seen as the enemy of society. Because if people are struggling to feed themselves, then more mouths isn't what you need. And since women are the people giving birth to the extra mouths, then women, and particularly women that become labeled as promiscuous, women that are seen as engaging in lots of relationships or enjoying relationships too much, women that are not under the control of their male relatives, are seen as a threat. A threat not just to themselves, but a threat to wider society. But simply in situations where you have the opposite, where you are in societies where people consider there to be too few people rather than too many people, then because women are the creators of the next generation, then there is also a desire to try to control women's bodies and women's wombs in order to try and determine how many more mouths are born and whether they are of the right type. So whether women are marrying the right men. So inequality, warfare, and population growth trends are the three things that historically tend to not turn out particularly well for women.
Yes.
And with it, that result in a whole load of constraints on women's lives, from veiling to forced seclusion to women being withdrawn from schools and the workplace, leaving women financially dependent on men in a way that doesn't help women and sadly doesn't help the economy either long term.
So, in this case, as we're looking at these three big themes, how does this play in today's society? One thing that I thought about as we're going through this is women often still rely on marrying up. And I know that there's been various studies done on this, that women who are usually college educated, have higher intellect, in general, oftentimes stay single.
Mhm.
Now, where do we see these other things play into effect as well?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that is exactly right. You can kind of understand that, can't you? I mean, I think so. Things perhaps of concern for me right now, concentrations of wealth, and in particular, perhaps how new technologies, how AI and so on, how those are going to play out in terms of inequality trends, wealth concentration, wealth inequality, and so on. Warfare. So sadly, I mean, particularly in a European and Middle Eastern context, we're seeing, sadly, increasing warfare that has never turned out to be good for women, I'm afraid. So, not at all a particularly positive trend. And then population trends, global population trends. On the one hand, in Western countries, we're worried about falling fertility rates. And increasingly, we're seeing pro-natalist policy trying to encourage or pressure women to have more children. But then, when you look more globally, the problem is in many ways, if we want to call it a problem, that is the opposite, is really still quite rapid population growth rates, a world that is struggling with natural resource crises, with environmental crises, struggling to feed the number of mouths that we have in the world. And, at the root of that, I would say, is a situation where far too few women in the world have the ability to take charge of their lives, in terms of achieving financial independence by going out into the world, getting a job, and so being able to make their own decisions about marriage. And also too little access to medical technologies that they need to take charge of their lives. And I think the world would be such a different place if ordinary women had that ability to take charge of their bodies, and that in turn requires the ability to access education and work so that they can achieve financial independence. But that is only going to happen by breaking the cult of female modesty Because if you truly believe that a woman's worth is purely based on her bodily modesty, then you don't allow your daughter to go to school, to go into the workplace, because you want to protect her from male pollution, from being polluted by men.
Thinking about this looking forward, if women's freedom wasn't the hidden driver of prosperity in the past, what lessons should policymakers, economists, and everyday people take for the future?
So let me just be controversial here and just let me
Go for it.
repeat my claim that I do think that when you look at places like ancient Egypt, when you do look at the early Roman economy, when you do look at Song Dynasty China, these were places that were economic hotspots in their own particular periods of history. And women were doing amazing things. They weren't just housewives, if I can say that. They were, building pyramids. They were plumbing ancient Rome. Did you know there were 4 times as many female plumbers in ancient Rome than there are in the US today as a proportion?
Very interesting.
Yeah. So in Song Dynasty China, women were doing, 101 different things, running tea houses, breeding silkworms, making the silk cloth that was the currency of trade on the Silk Road. So economies where women have been able to be a part of it have been immensely successful. Now, I'm not saying that things were perfect for women in those civilizations. They absolutely weren't. But relative to others at the time, women were in a pretty good place. And that is why those economies were, at the time, the world's economic hotspots. But what happened over time was women were marginalized, sidelined, restricted in terms of what they could do. And so, going forward, if we want to learn from the mistakes of history, if we want to avoid repeating past mistakes, then we need to keep our own economy on track. So we need to, as I've argued, women's economic freedom is really key to what has made the West best. And I would say, actually, that we should be proud of that. There's a lot to be proud of. But we need to make sure that we don't repeat the mistake of history, that we don't move backwards. Women have never been the passive victims or passive beneficiaries of the wealth created by men. We have always been, whether behind the scenes or up front, we have been active co-creators of wealth. Whether we've been given the credit for it or not is a different thing, but we have always been there. Now, I am sure if as women we keep on, we keep up the fight, then we will continue to achieve great things. But sometimes we're swimming against the tide.
Yes.
And perhaps we're having to do a bit more swimming than we might otherwise like to do.
Precisely. Now, what is one big takeaway that you want listeners to know, understand from this conversation?
So I was watching the news a few months ago, and I saw a commentator claim that there has never been a successful businesswoman in history, and that modern day prosperity was built pretty much entirely on the historic efforts of men. Now, I think what is sad is that he could make that claim. What is even sadder is that no one in the studio could confront him on that claim, could challenge him, because no one in the studio could actually name a female entrepreneur, investor, banker, industrialist from the past. We can all name people like JP Morgan and Henry Ford, but can we name their female equivalents? So what I would really like to do is for people to be able to take Economica and from that global economic history, pull out the names of women, the female equivalents to the JP Morgans and the Henry Fords, so that next time someone, whether in a studio or in a classroom or on public transport, is making those kinds of claims, we can all stand up and say, hang on a minute, what about Maggie L. Walker? What about Priscilla Wakefield? What about Bertha Benz? There are so many fantastic women in history that can both inspire us, but that can challenge this idea that a woman's natural place is in the home.
Victoria, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. This has been a masterclass in economics and also women's history. And to our listeners, the next time you hear someone say that the West got rich because of coal or colonies, remember this: prosperity has always depended on women's choices, women's labor, and women's freedom. So, if you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to Breaking Math, share this episode with a friend, and join our mailing list and Patreon where you can help guide future questions and conversations. Until next time, folks, keep questioning the equations, democracies, and societies in our everyday world. Stay curious and stay informed.